that.
Thank you, Mr. President, for availing yourself again to come and assist the Commission so that you could complete your evidence relating to your position as former Deputy President of the party and President of the party, and continue or start evidence relating to your position as former Deputy President of the country and current President of the country. Thank you for availing yourself. Let's do the oath. I think last time it was the oath, Mr. President, it was not an affirmation. May I ask you please to rise so that we can take the oath. Please state your full names for the record, Mr. President.
Cyril Matamela Ramaphosa.
Do you have any objection to taking the prescribed oath?
No, I do not have any objection to taking the prescribed oath.
Do you consider the oath binding on your conscience?
Yes, I consider the oath binding on my conscience.
Do you swear that the evidence you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing else but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you. You may be seated. Yes, Mr. Pretorius.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Mr. President. If you would agree, please, to remove your mask because the sound will not carry to the transcription. The social distancing is sufficient, we think, to protect all concerned. And if you could just switch on your microphone, please. Is it on? Great, thank you. Just to give an overview, Chair, today and tomorrow, I will conclude questions, hopefully within an hour, in relation to the previous appearance of the President in his capacity as President and Deputy President of the African National Congress. When that has been done, the President has asked to make an opening statement to introduce the next phase of the questioning dealing with the President's capacity as President of the country. After that, there will be questions from evidence leaders of certain of the state-owned entities concerning which evidence has been led. Advocate Seleka will question on affairs related to Eskom, Advocate Sony in relation to affairs related to PRASA, and Advocate Myberg in relation to Transnet. That should conclude the proceedings today, and then tomorrow I will ask questions of a general nature in relation to the President and his capacity as President of the country. We've agreed under your direction, Chair, to begin at 9 o'clock every day and go hopefully at least until, but as far as I'm aware, until 5 o'clock every day.
Okay. The stopping time, Mr. President, is that fine with you? At 5 o'clock?
I was told that the stopping time for the Commission is usually 4 p.m.
Yes, yes.
So,
there might have to be some discussions to see whether you would be available beyond 4 o'clock.
yes.
Okay, all right.
We can have a discussion, yes.
Okay, no, that's fine. That discussion can happen during the tea break and lunch break.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
And Chair and Mr. President, although every attempt has been made to distinguish clearly between questions relating to your capacity as President of the party and questions relating to your capacity as President of the country, there may be some grey areas where it's not possible to define the distinction clearly, but we can deal with that when the time comes. We have provided your office, Mr. President, with a substantial volume of documentation. I'm not going to go through the detail, but they're contained in the bundles behind you. In addition, certain documentation has been provided to us from your office and elsewhere. Those documents are also provided in the bundles behind you. But your statement is in bundle 3 behind you, and documents annexed in bundle 4.
Sure.
And then as preparation proceeded, a further bundle entitled the reference bundle has been compiled. There is at least one document that you've not had an opportunity to read, I understand, but by tomorrow, I think sufficient time has been agreed to be made available. I won't deal with any documents that you haven't looked at unless we discuss it first. Mm-hmm. Then, Chair, I'm conscious of constraints of time. In order to conclude the evidence relating to the issues raised at the President's last appearance, ideally one would have wanted a lot more time, but I'm going to try and complete that in an hour to give the other evidence leaders sufficient time today to complete their questions.
Yes, okay.
Mr. President, there are two issues really that remain to be dealt with in general terms from your last appearance. The first issue is the issue of deployment and questions related to deployment. The second issue is the issue of accountability and discipline within the party, and hopefully we can conclude those questions within the hour. But you will recall during your evidence there were at least 3 forms of appointment at the hands or related to the deployment committee that we discussed. There was the hard definition, the definition which illustrates that the deployment committee in effect instructs and commands in relation to appointments. Then there was the soft definition where, according to evidence given before the Commission on behalf of the ANC, the deployment merely makes a recommendation to the appointing authority or entity and no more. Then we discussed that there was a space in between those extremes where in substance and reality the deployment committee did impose its will on the appointing authority, although not in so many words, simply by the exercise of its leadership and power. And then we also discussed other forms of appointment where there's no intervention by the deployment committee at all in accordance with its own principles, but simply an appointment. For example, an appointment by the former president, and I think you conceded once on one occasion by yourself. And in the deployment committee minutes, to which we will refer in due course, you apologized to the deployment committee for having done that. But as I understand it, that is the framework within which the issue of deployment was discussed last time around. The position of the legal team, or certainly in relation to the questions we're going to put, is that the soft definition of employment, mere recommendation, and no more, is not borne out by the facts. There is strong evidence that has been led before the Commission that in fact the deployment committee commands or instructs or in fact makes the relevant appointments. The SOE evidence leaders will put this to you in the context of government in relation to state-owned entities, but there has been other evidence which we discussed last time around from Messrs. Ngubane, Leighton Ngubane, Brown and others. I'm not going to repeat that. But the answer to any disagreement between yourself and Mr. Mantashe on the one hand, and the evidence led before the Commission on the other, would lie in the Deployment Committee minutes. There we would have a contemporaneous record of the decisions that the Deployment Committee actually made in any particular period. And we've requested those from the attorneys for the ruling party. We've been told, firstly, that there are no minutes for the period 2012 to 2017. And I would just like to ask a question or two about that. When we are told that there are no minutes, are you aware whether there were minutes kept, but they have somehow been lost or destroyed, or whether simply when you were chair of the Deployment Committee, no minutes were taken? What is the position?
Chairperson, on the question of minutes, when I was chair of the Deployment Committee, I do not recall ever having to go through the minutes of the previous meeting. We always tended to deal with the issues at hand on a contemporaneous basis as they were presented. And quite often it would be either ministers who would come and say, we have shortlisted, there are so many applicants, and we would deal with that, and that would be done. And so I do not recall, when I was chair, any minutes being put forward for adoption, which is what often happens when you are a member of a committee, that minutes would be submitted, gone through and approved and adopted. So I do not recall, and I think you can ascribe that to rather unfortunate record-keeping processes, because in the main, the ANC has so many meetings, one after the other, so many committees, and I think those who are in charge will just take notes and just record a decision, and it's then communicated. So that would be my answer. But it has come to light now that the latter deployment committee process, which is, now being, not guess, but which is being chaired by the Deputy President, there are proper processes and minutes are kept. And I think it would be those minutes that may have been submitted.
Two questions in that regard, if I may, Mr. President. The first is that generally I understand that in the ruling or governing party and its history, there is a practice of taking minutes in matters or meetings of import. Is that not correct?
Yes, it is.
And secondly, it would be particularly important in the affairs of a deployment committee where ministers would meet with the committee over a period of time and over the period of more than one meeting to have a record. It seems rather strange that A, there were no minutes or no minutes available. As I understand your answer, you're not saying there were no minutes as a matter of fact, but just that you don't recall minutes being taken.
Yes.
Do you have any comment on that? It just seems improbable that there weren't minutes.
It may well sound improbable, but the minister or the person who would be bringing names or proposing names would rise from that meeting either immediately or thereafter, having been told by the SGO, and it would usually be the Deputy Secretary General, that the committee discussed this and it was comfortable with this and this proposition or proposal, and that is what would then happen. So I think the lapses of not really having those minutes should be understood within the context of an organization that's always on the go, that's always handling so many other processes. And indeed, yes, I mean, there are minutes that are also kept of either the working committee or the National Executive Committee. Those are like bigger and overarching structures. And we also have other committees, like what we call NEC committees, and those deal with policy matters. And if one were to dig, you would find that even those would deal with a paper and no real substantive minutes would be taken. It is clearly something, Chair, that needs to be improved. And it's part of what I have dubbed the renewal process, that we have dubbed the renewal process. We need to renew our own internal processes at an organizational, even administrative level, as well as our own political processes to deal with challenges that the organization faces from time to time, on an ongoing basis, rather, really.
We did then request the minutes of the deployment committee for the period post 2017, in other words, 2018 to 2021, and we received those, we requested them a month ago and received those on Friday evening. I'm not going to go into the reasons for the delay there, it's a collateral issue, but the records we have, and they're in the bundle before you, and I'd like to ask some questions about that. But before I do, can I ask, as far as you're concerned, was there any shift in policy or practice between the time when you were chair of the committee and the time where Mr. Mabuza was chair of the committee? Was there a change in policy known to you?
No, there wouldn't have been a change in policy. I think maybe a change in practice, because Deputy President Mabuza has tended to send ministers back and say, go back and process this again, and they would go back, sometimes pulling their hair out, and yet in my time the committee always found a way, but I guess his way maybe is much more effective. So the practice, yes, but the policy broadly, no. Policy largely in line with what I would say I described, which was also what National Chairperson of the ANC, Gwede Mantashe, also described.
The description you've just given of the approach of Deputy President Mabuza is in fact consistent with evidence you gave last time round about ministers coming back in frustration to the committee several times. And in fact, that evidence is consistent with the minutes, and I'll explain how we see it in a moment. But we can go through the minutes. It will take much longer than an hour, and I'm not sure that I have the time or capacity to do so. But I
haven't read them as well, that's the problem.
Well, perhaps we can spend a few minutes tomorrow on them by leave of the chair, because I do think it's important. We've reviewed those minutes, and certain themes emerge from those minutes. Now, we cannot obviously deal with the merits of each case because we don't have those facts. We only have the minutes and what emerges as a practice or policy from a reading of those minutes at face value. So, of course, it's subject to the facts of each particular case, and I must concede that in asking you these questions. But on our view, a general review of the minutes indicates that in large part, not always, but in large part, the hard definition that I've referred to, the deployment committee decides and instructs. That's the first proposition. Perhaps I can go through the propositions, you can consider them, and then we can decide what to do. The second issue is that the recommendation doesn't go from the committee to the appointing authority. It's the other way around. The minister or the appointing authority recommends, and it's the deployment committee that in its wisdom and according to its practice makes a decision, and that decision is then communicated. It's not universal, but it's by far the predominant way the deployment committee goes about its work in relation to appointing authorities. The third point that emerges is that on several occasions, certainly on more than isolated occasions, ministers come to the deployment committee and seek permission. Permission is the word that is used to proceed with the appointment process. And then the deployment committee will give the minister permission to proceed with appointment. Ministers are called to account by the deployment committee for presenting a fait accompli or presenting names to cabinet not approved by the disciplinary committee. There is a strict procedure that is often referred to that the ministers are called to account to follow under the supervision and direction, and I stress direction, of the committee, deployment committee. There are several occasions on which loyalty to the ruling party, party membership, and or hesitate to use the word subservience, but compliance with party prescripts is an issue which is relevant to the appointment. On occasions, and you've testified to this yourself, Mr. President, ministers' recommendations are not approved. They're sent back to the minister for, and the word is refinement. We're not accepting it. We'll consider it again when you come back to us. And that's consistent with your evidence, and we'll go back to that in a moment. There's even an occasion or occasions where the deployment committee insists that even before posts are advertised, that the deployment committee should be notified. But consistently throughout the minutes during this period, after you became president, to the present, to 2021, decisions are made in regard to appointments by the deployment committee. Final decisions which are imposed on the appointing authority. That is the language used. We can go through examples of the minutes, or you can perhaps take an opportunity to read overnight and we can revert to it briefly tomorrow. But what is your comment in that regard?
No, I think we should deal with it now, with respect. Chairperson, it is said that maybe the hard definition of the deployment committee's work is what has always prevailed. And as Mr. Pretoria says, maybe not all the time, but most of the time, I'd like to say that much as it may appear like it's the hard approach where it's instruct and command, in the end, there is, even if that were so, which I'd like to dispute in a minute, in the end, there is some safety net or process. Because in the end, even the ANC concedes this, even in its conference resolutions and its internal processes, that for government positions, in the end, the legally mandated process must be followed. Entirely, because there is in the current cabinet a non-ANC member, and they're independent, and they raise issues and questions, and for the most part, some of their questions would be about competence, would be about ability for the person to do the work or not. So much as it could be said that the hard approach, which is instruct, could have been used, when it goes through to cabinet, that is the filter. The filter then will finally come out with an outcome that may not have been, say, commanded by the Employment Committee. But I would like to dispute this hard definition and say, as far as I'm concerned, it's more the soft one, and it may well appear like it is the hard one. It's the soft one by sheer operation, because it's not an appointing committee. It does not appoint by definition and by its own existence. In the last evidence I gave here, I said it's a recommending committee. It recommends and proposes. And Chair, this is what happens in the, if you like, the political landscape also for our country. I did refer to an incident of another party, which is in government in one province in our country, where the person who was supposed to make the submission or the appointment, giving evidence to the public protector, said, and the Premier also said, before this, it must go to the federal committee. We do want to have that filter, that process. We may well have glossed over the issue of competence, and it's something that even our own conference has insisted we should now do, which is currently underway. But as political parties, we do want people who will go and implement the political mandate. And I also refer to the OECD paper on this matter, that the political involvement in administration, it was said in that paper, is essential for the proper functioning of democracy. And I would still insist that that is a consideration that we need to have in mind. Whilst saying that the deployment committee would always use the soft approach, which to Mr. Pretorius appears like it's a command and instruct approach. I would say, even if that may well be so, in the end, the safety of this process is that the final appointing entity in government or even on a board of directors, because in the end, the board of directors is the one that will say yea or nay for some appointments. So that provides the safety net or process. So I know that the issue of deployment has arisen as a major issue, but I would like to suggest that, much as it has, where the deployment has resulted in people who are incompetent, I will concede that that was an error. But where deployment leads to people who are competent, but who are also able to execute the mandate that the governing party has, as I have alluded to, the OECD recognizes that, and other political parties in the country also recognize that. As political institutions, we are elected to execute a particular mandate. And when you appoint people, you want people who are well synchronized, or will synchronize their work and activities with that mandate. But people who will also have competence and exercise independence. And I think that is the most important part, where they will have independence of action and execution, but within the broad framework of a particular mandate to fulfill what the organization will have set itself to achieve.
All right. Perhaps just to illustrate the general point I was making by relation to specific wording in the minutes, Mr. President, on the 20th of January 2020, in relation to appointments in the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. It's recorded in the minute, the committee resolved to accept the three proposals. In other words, final decision. Under the head, the Department of Public Service and Administration, the committee resolved to accept the first woman and candidate to be a Director General at that level. Under the Department of Mineral and Energy, the committee resolved to accept the Minister's proposal and that the Minister must further engage with the DSG. Under Defence, the Board proposed the name of the current acting CEO to be considered, which is what the Minister came to present. The committee allowed the Minister to go ahead with the process, but was also reminded that in future she must work with the Office of the DSG. The opposite happened on the 30th November 2020. Department of Transport, Minister Mbalula. The presentation was not accepted by the Deployment Committee. There were issues raised with regard to processes being followed and the candidates and the makeup of the board. The item was sent back to be refined. Plenty of examples of that, but if you wish to debate it again tomorrow, we can do so. That is just one aspect of the evidence. The other aspect of the evidence, of course, is the contemporaneous evidence given by various people before the Commission, which the Chair will take into account in making his decision. There are two other matters that arise. I don't know that we can go into the issue of political theory too much, but there's an interesting minute in the bundle where a member
I'm
of
sorry,
the
Mr. Pretorius, are you moving away from the deployment committee matters?
No, I'm dealing with two more issues.
You're still well, okay, all right.
If I may, Chair.
Yes, no, that's fine. But maybe let me ask this question, Mr. President.
Yes, please.
Within the context of the practices of the deployment committee, how it deals with matters, what would be the role of, I don't know whether it's the principle or what it is, but namely that there is only one center of power. It is the party. If that is still the position, I know at some stage there were issues about whether there are two centers of power, government and party, but it seems to me that it may well be that if that is the principle, that it would contemplate that the real decisions are taken within the party. So what would be the role of that principle within the context of the work of the deployment committee?
Well, Chair, yes, the party is where power resides. Our democracy is such that it delineates political parties as the vehicles through which the masses of our people demonstrate their support through their votes for a party that then finally has representatives in parliament, in the cabinet, and so forth. So the party then plays a key role. But the party is just one of the actors in our democracy. It's not the only actor, and in the end, when we're talking about the state, you look at the state, what makes up the state is the three arms of the state, so the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature, and there are a whole number of other institutions that finally make up the broader state that we talk about. So the party does play a role, and when it comes to matters of governance that impact either on the executive or the legislature, it does play a role. So therefore, its decisions I regard as proposals as they finally go forward, either to the executive or to parliament. For instance, a party will take a decision that we need a piece of legislation, say on gender-based violence, that those who get involved in either murdering or raping women should be sentenced to 20 life sentences. It becomes a proposal by the party that has to be filtered through another institution, which would be your parliament. And to the extent that it enjoys support, then it becomes the order of the day. Similarly, even with the cabinet, not every member of the cabinet sits on the decision-making structures of the party, and they may well have views that are not such all those values, and they may well raise an issue and say, but this person that is being proposed, much as they've been proposed by the party, is not the best person that we should have. And I give you another good example, and this I encounter all the time, where, yes, the party may well, the proposal may well come from government to the party about appointing certain people, and you find that there isn't any gender balance. Maybe there's just one female and others are male. It will be sent back, and the party will say, no, this is where the party's insistence has counted for a lot. It will say, send it back. We're not prepared to adopt this. And when it comes to youth deployment as well, that we need more young people to be brought into structures. So the party then, for lack of a better word, then becomes a filter, and a very positive filter. And now more and more focusing on competence, on professionalism, and capability to do the work, but finding a balance. And another balance would be on demographic balance of our country. And sometimes the temptation is we will just take mostly males and mostly African, and the party will say, no, this does not represent the demographic composition of our country. So send it back, and then you have to juggle again. So the party then plays an important role, and it is a standard bearer, and it wants to insist on the values of itself. It's got values, and values that are representative of what the people of South Africa would like to see.
Thank you, Mr. Pretorius.
In that regard, in fairness to you, Mr. President, there is at least one occasion in the minutes where demographics is emphasized as a principle in favor of a white candidate, in fact. So I understand that point. And it may be that the process of appointments is secondary to the quality of the appointments that are ultimately made, but that's another issue that we will deal with later. But an interesting point in relation to the question that the chair asked, there's a passage in the minute which illustrates the frustration on the part of a member of the deployment committee, saying that people accountable to the committee don't really understand the principle of democratic centralism. What does that mean?
Well, democratic centralism is a political concept. That's a fairly straightforward one. It basically means that when a higher body takes a decision, and I can give it to you more colorfully in terms of, of the field that you operate in, acting Chief Justice, when the Constitutional Court takes a decision on any matter, that is the end. Every other court will follow the dictum or the decision that's been taken by the Constitutional Court. So being a political organization, in order to have discipline, in order to have proper organizational processes, democratic centralism means that when a higher body takes a decision, like in our case, when conference takes a decision, it is binding on everyone, on all the structures. When the national executive takes a decision, even if you may not agree with it, just like the Constitutional Court takes a decision, even if you may have different views and may not agree with what the Constitutional Court has decided, it is binding, because as a society we've signed a contract with one another that there will be one arbiter of all our matters and disputes. And similarly in a political organization, certainly in the ANC, that is the case. The contract that each one of us signs when we join is that the upper structure on taking a decision is binding on everyone. And that is why it is a sign of indiscipline in the African National Congress for anyone to then want to use a word like disobey and not follow the decisions of a higher structure. It is looked upon in a very dim way, and it shouldn't happen, because that's how we balance our activities in society in relation to judiciary and also in relation to our own organization. So that's what democratic centralism means.
And the term was used, in fact, in the context of, in this case, the centre being the deployment committee. But if we may move on, there is one issue that I should raise with you Mr. President, in relation to a meeting of the Deployment Committee of 22 March 2019. If you want to look at it, it's in the bundles in front of you. But I'm just going to summarize what the meeting determined. The meeting noted that the Judicial Services Commission was considering the filling of vacancies in the judiciary. The Deployment Committee recommended 2 justices to seats to fill vacancies in the Constitutional Court. It recommended a judge to fill a position on the Supreme Court of Appeal and in other capacities as well, including Deputy Judge President in a province. So the question arises is, what is the committee doing recommending appointments to the judiciary?
Chairperson, I go back to my earlier explanation that the Deployment Committee, particularly in a case like this, would play the role of saying, there is a vacancy, and it often happens when another person who's been deployed in government, who would normally be your Minister of Justice, saying, hey, there are vacancies. But the Deployment Committee knows that at best, all it can ever do is to note, 1, that there's a vacancy, 2, that there are certain names that could, be proposed. And having done that, it also knows very well that it is not the appointing structure. And by definition, by the way our Constitution works, it could never, ever have a judge appointed, because that is a process that is done through the JSC, and what comes out of the JSC is the will of those people who sit on the JSC. But what that Deployment Committee has often insisted on, Acting Chief Justice, is that we need to have a gender balance. We need to have a demographic balance. And that message often, is raised more regularly and more pointedly by the African National Congress. And I can say, as a deployee of the ANC, that the fact that today we've got so many female judicial officers, it's because the ANC, and you could say, through various structures, has been insisting. It could be the ANC Women's League, it could be the ANC itself, and so on, has been insisting that we must have more female judicial officers. But we must also have a balance. There must be a demographic balance. We must have people of Indian origin, colored, Africans, and whites. And that has been, without any doubt or equivocation, been the insistence of the party that I lead. And so in that regard, I think we should look at it positively. Positively because it has really insisted on this approach. To the extent that people want to look at it negatively, you need to be alive to the fact that, if anything, it was just identification of names and being aware. But in the end, the ANC does not decide and cannot decide. And I would be the first to say, you cannot, as the ANC, choose judges And that is why it was the ANC itself that insisted that the Constitution should be crafted in the way that it is to be able to have that level of non-partisanship, independence, and you must have all those people who sit on the JSC. And it is something that I feel strongly about.
Well, there is the question, Mr. President, whether if the ANC or the deployment committee, maybe let's say the ANC, wants to influence the appointment of certain people within government, whether it should not do that transparently, so that everybody knows, rather than do it in some office somewhere where there is no transparency, and you end up with, in the case of a minister who may be coming to an interview, to interview candidates for a certain position, on the basis that the deployment committee has said it should be so and so. And yet there are a number of candidates. But apart from the minister, nobody else knows that there is this influence that has been given to the minister that it should be so and so. So there is the question whether if they want to influence appointments, they shouldn't do it transparently, as opposed to doing it in this way. Maybe I shouldn't describe what this way is, but in this way, I mean, if you talk about what Mr. Pretorius was referring to, where they were discussing candidates for various courts as judges, you have in the JSC members of parliament,
Yes.
who are members of the ANC. And one would have thought that the ANC would take the position that says members of parliament who are members of the ANC know what the ANC stands for, know what the ANC would like to see happen in the judiciary, those issues of demographics and whatever. So in making their own contribution in a transparent way, because the JSC process is transparent, they will be doing so knowing what the ANC would like to see. Sure. And therefore you don't have this situation where in some office in Lutuli House, the candidates for judgeship is being discussed by people whose views will not be subjected to public scrutiny, as would happen with members of the JSC. And candidates won't get a chance to defend themselves or say, but, I should be appointed because of ABCD, when the deployment committee said, no, we think so and so is the right one.
Chairperson, I think it is a suggestion that in a number of instances does get implemented. And I will cite one recent example where, for instance, the officials of the ANC decided that a particular person should be deployed as, and I can speak about it now, as the Speaker of Parliament, and then the caucus of the ANC then meets and then decides that, yes, we want to propose this person, so that is transparent. The one that may not have been transparent is what the officials decided. It could only be transparent if, after the officials having taken the decision, then publicize it that we are going to suggest that, to caucus, that this person should be nominated. I think it's an interesting proposition, which, as I said, does get implemented at times. And I recall, and I'll cite another example, I recall the question that was put to me when we had to appoint the NDPP of the NPA. And the question, I decided as president that I wanted to open it up, to make it transparent and to have an interview process, and nominations should be made, which was quite new, but it happened, and maybe I'll talk about it later. It was a process where names were put forward, and the question was asked of me whether I, as president, want to single out one person. And I held back, and I said, it might be a difficult one, because let the process unfold, because in the end I have to make the call or the decision. So it is a proposition that is interesting, where to remove this shroud of secrecy, maybe the party should be able to show its hand that this is how we would like to do it. And I guess it happens in other environments worldwide. Because in the end, political parties do have their preferences when it comes to various positions. And I know that in the US, for instance, parties do say, we prefer this one as the Chief Justice and this one as the Judge of Appeal and all that. And we don't do that. And maybe we need to grow up and see how best the democratic process can mature to that level.
Thank you. Mr. Proteus.
Just to refer finally back to the meeting of the 22nd of March of the Deployment Committee in relation to appointments to the judiciary. This is not a case, Mr. President, of the party recommending or even insisting that certain principles be followed in the composition of the judiciary. This is a case where the committee actually recommended named judges, which is something different, or candidates for the bench. And in the context of the policy of democratic centralism, clearly the recommendation of a particular name for a particular post must have been intended to influence the decision of the Judicial Service Committee. Otherwise, what would be the point? These recommendations would be clearly and probably communicated to the members of the Judicial Service Committee in order to influence them in their decision.
Well, I would say, maybe I'll go back to what I said, where I say the real safety for the process is that the Deployment Committee is not the appointing entity. You may well say influence. Yes, political party will always seek to influence, precisely what you were also saying, that maybe if you want to influence, do it transparently. And I would buy into that. Do it openly and say, we support this one and that one. And in the end, even the public does get involved sometimes when there's, nominations for judges or top positions. They'll say, this one is preferable. And when that person has not been appointed, there's an outcry that, they left out this one and so on. So influence, yes, but appointment, no. Because in the end, the ANC Deployment Committee is not the appointing structure. And whatever the appointing structure is, including the president, when finally names, as our process dictates, names are presented to the president will also take into account the processes that took place in the Judicial Services Commission. So I can hear Mr. Pretorius is going very hard on this issue of influence, but I'd like to say, whatever the influence would be, will always be tempered by the inability of the ANC Deployment Committee to appoint. It does not appoint and should not appoint.
Of course, what is quite obvious, Mr. President, when we discuss this is that the influence of the deployment committee may be quite weighty, particularly on those members of the JSC who are ANC MPs, and they might not want to go against such an important structure of the ANC if it has already indicated its preference. And that may be unsatisfactory because, well, I don't know at what stage that recommendation was made in that case, but if it is made before the interviews, for example, it may well be that it would have the effect that some ANC members who are MPs, who are in the JSC, might be unduly inclined towards a particular candidate in circumstances where they should be quite open. You know. So I'm just saying, it's one thing to say the deployment committee is not the appointing authority.
Yes.
But the reality might be that once the deployment committee has made its preference clear, already a member, maybe I should say, a disciplined member of the ANC, who, would be inclined to put a lot of weight on that recommendation in circumstances where he or she should approach the interviews in a very open-minded manner.
Chairperson, I think we must accept that we live in a world where lobbying takes place for placement of people anywhere, where lobbying, there are sometimes lobby groups, lobbyists and all that, people who for one reason or other would prefer certain persons or candidates to be placed in certain positions. That happens all over the world all the time. Be it, in a lowly position or a high-placed position. So if one accepts that, there will be people and groups of people who will articulate their preferences. It should not be seen as something that is evil or dastardly wrong. If it is meant to achieve illegal, unlawful ends, then there is a problem. But if it is meant that there should be names that can be put forward, for instance, to achieve a particular purpose, like we want more women in the judiciary, and we know this lawyer and that person who should be put forward. I don't necessarily think that there's anything wrong with it. Because otherwise, how do we achieve the transformation that we seek to achieve? Will it happen of its own volition? How will it happen? It will happen because people are lobbying or are articulating those positions. And I'd like to suggest that unless the proposition that's being put forward is that this resulted in unlawfulness, in something completely wrong, and should not happen at all, then I will take the point. But the proposition you put forward that maybe it should happen transparently appeals to me, because then it no longer is done in the dark corners, if one wants to say the committee operates in those. It is done openly and transparently, and it's certainly something that I would like to take up for debate and discussion in my party, because to me it makes a lot of sense.
No, I think what I was putting to you is more in the context of there being no transparency.
Yes.
So if there is no transparency, this lobbying or whatever is happening secretly.
Yes, yes.
But where it's transparent,
Yes.
so it can be debated, it can be looked at, can be scrutinized. That might stand on a different footing, where there is transparency. I think part of the problem is where it's maybe secret is the right word. I'm not sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you and I have never agreed on anything, Acting Chief Justice. On this one, we agree.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Pretorius.
In your recent answer, Mr. President, you raised the issue of international practice. May well be, for example, the example that springs to mind is the appointment of the Supreme Court in the United States of America. The point, I think, is that our Constitution demands the highest standards, even compared to international jurisdictions.
Indeed.
And it is those standards that we apply here. But in relation to constitutionality of the deployment policy and practice, the chair will decide. It's a legal question ultimately that I'm not sure should be debated. But would you concede that loyalty to the party or party membership should never be a determining factor in appointment to public office?
Yes, I would say that. And even this decision that was taken by the party at its conference was that we should lay more emphasis on capacity, professionalism, and also non-partisanship. Because that is the best way any civil servant would be able to serve the people of South Africa. So, yes, I would.
And one is conscious, of course, of evidence in relation to loyalty or party loyalty, again in relation to appointments to public office, that has been given by the former president, but that's a matter of record. I needn't debate that with you. If I may go to the second issue, unfortunately, briefly, and that is the question of discipline and accountability. You gave quite stark evidence last time around, Mr. President, in relation to corruption within the ranks of the ruling party and its prevalence over a period of over 20 years. That's a matter of record. I'm going to go back there. But there are two issues arising out of that evidence. The one is specificity, and the second is accountability. In relation to specificity, the chairperson did ask last time round. The chairperson said, I would like you to identify the actual areas where you say as a party we have done our homework. We think this is where we did not do what we were supposed to do properly. This is where we did something we should not have done. So we identify exactly areas where as a party you say, yeah, we did not do things the way we should have, and we acknowledge. And the point of that question is highlighted by the chair when he says, then one can look at what should be put in place for the future so that there is no repeat. And that's been partly discussed now in relation to the issue of transparency. And perhaps in relation to specificity, we can talk more tomorrow when you give evidence in the capacity as your role as president, because there are certain issues that must be discussed in that regard. But again, we asked for documents. We requested the ANC disciplinary records, and what we received were records of the ANC's National Disciplinary Committee and the National Disciplinary Committee of Appeal for the period 2014 to 2021. And although there are occasions when party members are disciplined for a range of internal party matters, we did not find in those documents a single case of an ANC member being disciplined in relation to corruption in those documents. Now, given the prevalence of corruption, which has been conceded, and given the period of time over which this corruption has been identified, since the 1990s, to date, not to 2017, 2018, to date, is it not a matter of concern that the party has not generally, there may be single exceptions, generally called to account in the context of the party itself, people found guilty, accused of corruption? It's a matter of concern, I put it.
Yes, it is a matter of concern. It is a matter that I sought to address in my appearance here. And I did say that there has been contestation within the party on a number of matters, but especially this one. And in that regard, I did concede that the party, for the most part, did not really live up to the value system that is the bedrock of its existence, which was put in place by the founding fathers and mothers of the organization, and that in latter days there was a lapse. And in addressing my letter as president of the ANC to members, I did decry this, and I raised it. And it is on issues of dealing with corruption that I said we must draw a line in the sand. We must now decide as the ANC that we are now going to take the issue of corruption seriously. And the diagnostic report that was tabled at our 54th conference also speaks to this. The renewal process that we've been involved in, that we are involved in now, also talks to this. Yes, there have been some cases which may not have surfaced at the level of the NDC and NDCA, where yes, discipline was taken on corruption matters, but they have not been as robust as they should be, and they have not been as overarching as they should be. But we have now said we've drawn a line in the sand, and with the resolutions that were taken at the 54th conference, much as there's been contestation within the party itself, the membership has embraced this, and the issue of discipline and accountability is being taken up much more seriously. And we as a party have also realized what our lackadaisical approach to this has meant to the party in terms of support, because our surveys, our research has told us that ordinary people abhor corruption, and they've not always seen the ANC as taking action against those in its own ranks who have been involved in corrupt acts. But now the game has changed. The line has been drawn in the sand, and the ANC is saying that we are renewing ourselves. And we are, Chairperson, possibly the only party in the land which has borne its own chests and said that we are prepared to hang out our linen in the open, and now, having drawn the line in the sand, we are going now to be very serious about dealing with corruption, because we've realized that corruption actually militates against the interests of our people. You may well say, well, why didn't you do so over a period of so many years? But it's better late than never. And in this case, we are serious about what we are saying. Thank you.
We will, thank you, Mr. President. We will deal with one pertinent series of examples in this regard, and in your deal with your capacity, or in your capacity as President of the country, but that will be tomorrow. For the moment, I must retire to the bench, and the bomb squad must take over.
The bomb squad?
The three other
So they have
evidence
the bomb
leaders.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sure they'll be very gentle. May we take 5 minutes for the changeover?
Before we do that, Mr. Pretorius, I'm not sure I understood where you would like the President to deal with that question that I'd raised with him, namely that I wanted the President to identify the areas where they say, as the party, we have reflected and we have identified that this is where we didn't do what we were supposed to do, this is where we did what we were not supposed to do. Because I did, when I looked at the affidavit that has been prepared, I didn't pick up where he deals with that. So I'm not sure whether you were suggesting that that be dealt with tomorrow. I just want to make sure.
Yes, Chair. It may disturb the order of things and the neatness of the categories that we're dealing with, but I have drawn the President's attention to the specific question you asked.
Yeah.
Perhaps we could spend some time tomorrow dealing with the direct answer so that the President can consider it.
No, that's fine. I'm quite happy for it to be dealt with tomorrow. I just want to make sure we don't forget about it.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, we'll deal with it
And then,
tomorrow.
Chair, of course, before my learned friends ask their questions, the President does wish to make an opening statement in relation to his capacity as President of the country.
Okay, all right. Just to make sure we are all on the same page, will your colleagues be questioning the President in his capacity as former Deputy President of the country and current President of the country?
Yes, Chair.
Or not for the party?
As I said, there may be some grey areas,
Yeah,
but they are minor in
Yes.
quantity.
No, that's
and
fine.
it's, as you stated, President of the country.
Yeah,
And Deputy
okay.
President of the country.
Okay, no, that's fine. Let's take then about 5 minutes to enable whatever logistical arrangements need to be made. I intend that we take a tea break, our tea break at normal time, which is 11:15. So that will be 15 minutes. That is at 11:15. For now, we are looking at 5 minutes or so. Okay, we adjourn. I understand, Mr. Slega, that I need to allow the President to make a statement first before you can ask any questions.
Yes, Chair.
Mr. President, you may make your statement.
Thank you, Chairperson. I welcome this opportunity to address you as I now appear before you in my capacity as the former Deputy President of the Republic, as well as that is the former Deputy President from May 2014 to February 2018. And in the statement that I have submitted to the Commission, I outlined the roles and the responsibilities of the Deputy President and my knowledge of matters under consideration by the Commission. I'm also here, Chairperson, in my capacity as the President of the Republic of South Africa from February 2018, having taken office soon after the establishment of the Commission. While the Commission is tasked to investigate and report on events that took place before I assumed office of President, I describe in my statement some of the measures taken to right the wrongs of state capture, of the state capture period, in the hope that it may be of value to the Commission. My approach is informed by an understanding that the Commission is meant to focus on establishing the veracity of specific instances of alleged state capture and identify the systemic weaknesses in state institutions that allowed state capture to occur. Chairperson, in my statement, I outline when I became aware of the nature and extent of state capture. It is important to note that few people, even at the best of times, have had line of sight of everything taking place in the state, and that happens to be the case even today. And this, Chairperson, applies even to members of Cabinet and the Deputy President, particularly with respect to activities that were deliberately hidden from view. Many of the incidents of corruption that would in time be described as state capture became known to me as they did to the general public through the work of journalists, civil society organizations, and institutions such as the Public Protector and Auditor General. Reports of court cases and disciplinary proceedings, together with the commendable work of investigative journalists and whistleblowers, did help to give insight into corruption in both government and in the private sector. As it became increasingly clearer through the so-called Gupta leaks and other revelations that a network of individuals was seemingly colluding with a number of people in government to occupy key positions and capture key institutions, the question that arose was how best one should respond to all this. I guess, Chairperson, this was a question that not only I myself had to grapple with, but also other members of the executive who were deeply concerned about these developments as they saw them unfolding. In my case, and I guess it also affected a number of other people, I would say I had 5 options. The first option for me was to resign. The second would have been to speak out And the third would have been to acquiesce and abet and just go along. And the fourth would have been to keep quiet and remain silent. And the fifth option would have been to remain, but to resist, hoping that we can turn things around. The first option for me, Chairperson, that was available to me was to resign from the executive. While I would have earned quite a lot of praise from many quarters, this action of resignation would have significantly impaired my ability to contribute to bring about what I would call an end to state capture. It would have caught the big headlines, newspapers, and that would have been the end of it. Had I and like-minded individuals resigned from the executive, we would have had no ability to resist some of the excesses that were taking place. And there was a clear danger that without some measure of resistance, there would have been even fewer impediments to the unfettered expansion of the state capture project. It was also important to pursue and sustain the many government programs that were vital to the transformation of our society and the improvement of our people's lives. The second option was for me to be more confrontational, to speak out publicly against certain decisions or actions of the government as they were happening in that captured way. While there were instances where I did make public statements, there was also a limit to how confrontational one could be in the position that I held. A more confrontational approach would most likely have led to my removal from office, with the same consequences as resignation, in that my ability to effect change would have been greatly constrained, if not brought to an end. The third option was to acquiesce and thereby abet the committing of the misdeeds, just to go along and be part of it all. This I would not and could not do. It would have been a violation of my principles and a profound betrayal of my responsibility to the government, my own organization, and the people of South Africa. The fourth option available to me was to remain in my position as Deputy President and keep silent. This may have been the easier path, but it was, in my view, not much different from acquiescing and going along. The final option for me, which is what I chose, was to remain in my position as Deputy President, not to resign, not to acquiesce and go along and join in, or not to be confrontational, but to work with others in the executive to resist the abuses and bring about change where we could, and to sustain the work of social and economic transformation. Now, this meant staying in the arena with the challenges and limitations and frustrations inherent in doing so. But it was the course of action that had the greatest likelihood of bringing state capture to an end, restoring the institutions of state, and defending our democracy. It needs to be remembered that governance is not merely a technical function. It is an inherently political function which is influenced by the dynamics and the exercise of political power. My ability and the ability of others to resist and ultimately to bring about changes that would end state capture relied to a large measure on the political balance of forces within the executive itself, within the governing party, and within society more broadly. That was among the reasons why I chose to remain in the position of Deputy President, why I worked with others through the democratic process to shift the balance of forces, and why ultimately I agreed also to make myself available for the position of the President of the African National Congress at its 54th National Conference in December 2017. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, I'm certain that this was the necessary and correct course of action that I took. Others may not agree, but for me, this was the better and the best course of action that I could take. Fundamentally, this approach enabled the far-reaching changes the country has gone through over the past 3 years, including the disruption of state capture project and the rebuilding of damaged institutions. It was also possible through this approach to resist some of the more egregious and obvious abuses of power. And maybe one will cite just a few. For instance, the replacement of Mr. Nhlanhla Nene as Minister of Finance with Mr. Des van Rooyen provides a useful illustration of this. On the evening of 9th December 2015, former President Zuma announced the removal of Mr. Nene and the appointment of Mr. van Rooyen. This had an immediate impact on the financial markets. Shortly after Mr. van Rooyen was sworn in, the Director General of Treasury, Mr. Lungisa Fuzile, asked to meet me urgently. He expressed grave concern based on his interaction with the new minister and his advisors. Great concern about the impact this development would have on the ability of National Treasury to properly exercise its function. Concerned by what I considered the capture of National Treasury, because to me, the capture of National Treasury was almost the final culmination of state capture, because you capture National Treasury, then you have basically captured the entire state, because that is where the money is, that is where it is controlled. And after having that meeting with the then Director General, who described to me in fairly graphic terms how he feared that now National Treasury had been captured, I also got concerned. I immediately contacted the then and now ANC Deputy Secretary General, Jessie Duarte, and indicated in a meeting with her that this is what had happened, and I was now really concerned that state capture had reached this level. And I said to her that I would resign my position, Deputy President of the Republic, and I believe that that message was conveyed to the then President. And maybe that would have raised a concern, I don't know. Then there was a flurry of consultations that involved some of the ANC officials expressing disquiet about the appointment of Mr. Des van Rooyen, the then ANC Secretary General Gwede Mantashe, Ms. Duarte and myself urged the President to appoint another person as the Finance Minister because the reaction in the financial markets was turning to be quite horrific. And it is then that we urged that he should appoint Mr. Pravin Gordhan to calm the markets and also for me to remove the specter that I saw of state capture, capturing treasury. I believe the decision by President Zuma to replace Mr. Van Rooyen with Mr. Gordhan was critical in preventing further damage to the economy and safeguarding the integrity of national treasury. And there were other instances which I detail in my statement where it was necessary to make public statements on decisions which are considered contrary to national interest. One such instance was the removal of Mr. Gordhan and Mr. Mcebisi Jonas as Minister and Deputy Minister of Finance, respectively, on 30th March 2017. At the meeting, when former President Zuma informed the ANC officials of his decision, I raised my concern that the Minister and Deputy Minister were being removed on the basis of unsubstantiated intelligence reports. And I told the former President that I disagreed with his reasons, and that when asked, as I expected I would be asked by the media and other people, I would publicly state my objection. And I said that to him up front, and as did other officials who also spoke out. While I reiterated that the President has the constitutional prerogative in terms of our Constitution to appoint and dismiss members of the Cabinet, I felt it was necessary to speak out, especially because of the serious consequences this decision would have on our economy and on our country. Since assuming the office of President in 2018 February, the government that I lead has undertaken several measures to end state capture, to rebuild damaged institutions, and to foster a culture of ethical public service and accountability. In the main, the measures have aimed at changing the way the Cabinet functions, strengthening institutions that had been captured, starting with changes in the leadership of some of these institutions, changing the way in which our state-owned enterprises also work, and the way they were managed and overseen by government as shareholder, and making necessary policy decisions to address shortcomings and to reinforce oversight. One of the critical projects currently underway to strengthen the state involves the professionalization of the public service. Now, this aims to ensure that the public service is shorn of political partisanship and that the most qualified individuals enter its ranks. This is a very current development that we're fostering. As this commission has heard, law enforcement agencies were deliberately weakened to limit their ability to act against those involved in corruption and state capture. It has therefore been a priority and remains an ongoing task of the administration I lead to rebuild and to restore the integrity of these institutions. I therefore decided that the appointment, for instance, of the new National Director of Public Prosecutions should be undertaken through a public and transparent process. This was the first time an NDPP was appointed in such a manner which did much to restore the confidence of South Africans in the institution. We have established the Investigating Directorate in the Office of the NDPP to work on the high-profile complex cases of corruption and fraud. Its members have unique expertise in this field, and it has shown this entity the capacity to speed up investigations and see prosecutions do take place. The NPA has started to make significant strides in combating corruption, and I'm confident that it will continue to do so. In May 2018, I established the Nugent Commission of Inquiry to investigate governance failures at SARS and to propose ways to restore confidence of taxpayers. Its recommendations are now being implemented to redress the wrongs of the past and to ensure that SARS never again falls prey to the improper motives of a privileged few. The impact of this work is already evident at SARS. Other areas of progress include the work with the NPA's Asset Forfeiture Unit, the work that it has done to recover the proceeds of economic crimes, recapacitating the NPA with more qualified personnel, and changes in the leadership of entities such as the Public Investment Corporation. Chairperson, this has been supplemented by the work of the Fusion Center, where all relevant law enforcement entities share information and support each other in investigating these kinds of corruption. Discussion of how to institutionalize this form of cooperation are now underway. The SIU Tribunal started its work in October 2019, and since it started its work has shown its value in recouping monies wrongfully taken from state coffers. As has been made plain in this commission, our intelligence services are in dire need of attention. To this end, the implementation of the recommendation of the high-level review panel, which was chaired by Dr. Sidney Mufamadi, is at an advanced stage. I'm assured by the leadership of the relevant agencies that illegal operations identified both by the panel report and the investigations conducted by state security agency leadership are being identified, and they're also being terminated. The investigations continue on these and other wrongs within the SSA and in collaboration with law enforcement agencies. Covert activities are now subject to scrutiny by the Auditor General, something that we welcome. Late in December 2019, I also reconstituted the National Security Council, which is chaired by the President to ensure better coordination of intelligence and security-related functions of the state. Political responsibility of the state's security agency now resides in the Presidency, and deliberations continue on the panel's recommendations to split up the SSA into distinct domestic and foreign intelligence services. Government envisages a fundamental overhaul of state-owned enterprises model that addresses not only the deficiencies that permitted widespread corruption, but that also enables these companies to effectively fulfill their social and economic mandates in a sustainable manner. To this end, Cabinet has established the Presidential State-Owned Enterprise Council to reposition our SOEs as effective instruments of economic development through stronger oversight and strategic management. Government is working towards an SOE ownership model that clearly separates the responsibility of ownership, policy development, and regulation. Effective ownership will become more centralized to enable greater transparency, accountability, and oversight, and subject all strategic SOEs to more rigorous requirements for financial as well as operational performance. We are implementing standard guidelines on the appointment and remuneration of SOE boards and executives that prioritize the recruitment and retention of the appropriate skills and experience and competencies that we need in these bodies. This includes a clear delineation of authority and responsibility between elected public officials, non-executive directors, as well as executive leadership. Chairperson, we are working to ensure the rigorous implementation of controls over the use of public money as the best way to protect the abuse of these funds. The National Anti-Corruption Strategy, which was developed together with the representatives from business, trade unions, academia, and civil society, including religious organizations, was approved by Cabinet. The Health Sector Anti-Corruption Forum, which was launched in September 2019, is a critical element of our fight against corruption also. Now, legislative changes have been made and others are underway to fight corruption and reduce the likelihood of a recurrence of state capture. Now, the amendment of the Public Audit Act is a good demonstration of this, to give the Auditor General more power. Now, this is a significant step in the fight against state capture as it targets the perpetrators of fraud and theft. Now, another set of powerful measures to prevent corruption and state capture include changes in the way that the public service is managed. Critical sections of the Public Administration Management Act have now commenced. These include the prohibition of all public service employees conducting business with the state, the development of norms and standards of integrity, ethics, and discipline in the public service, and the establishment of the Office of Standards and Compliance. Further sections will be commencing this year, and legislation meant to entrench greater checks and balances in public procurement is in the pipeline and will be finalized as soon as possible. Now, Chairperson, the Commission has asked me to address several other matters, including allegations made by witnesses against me before this Commission. These are addressed in detail in the statement that I have submitted to the Commission. There is one particular issue on which I wish to comment now, since it has received such widespread attention and can easily be disposed of. This relates to the allegations made by Mr. Brian Molefe and Mr. Machela Koko in relation to the stake that I held in Optimum Mine prior to my entry into government and my later responsibilities in respect of the ESCOM war room. While I was in business, I participated in a commercial consortium with Glencore in the acquisition of Optimum Holding, which acquisition was concluded in June 2012. I acquired an effective 9.64% shareholding in Optimum Holdings and became a non-executive chairperson of Optimum Holdings. In that role, chairperson, I had no operational involvement in Optimum Holdings or Optimum Mine. I was non-executive chairperson. Following my election as ANC Deputy President in December of 2012, I initiated a review of my business interests to avoid potential conflict. As part of this process, on the 6th of June 2013, I resigned as a director of Optimum Holdings, and on the 22nd of May 2014, I disposed of my shareholding in Optimum Holdings ahead of my appointment as Deputy President of the Republic. I had no further involvement or interest in Optimum after that point. In December 2014, President Zuma assigned to me the responsibility to oversee efforts to turn around several SOEs that were in dire straits. I was asked to give guidance and direction to existing governing structures, focusing on the unique challenges of each structure. As is apparent now, this work required collective commitment by all governance structures and was a long-term endeavor. Only recently have we started to truly make progress on the challenges that a number of state-owned enterprises have been facing, such as SAA, Eskom, and other SOEs. As part of this responsibility, I chaired an interministerial committee on resolving the country's severe energy challenges. This IMC exercised political responsibility for the Eskom Technical War Room, which was set up to support the implementation of the 5-point action plan, which we can talk about, adopted by the Cabinet to address the electricity. The War Room was under the day-to-day direction of deputy ministers of relevant departments and comprised representatives of Eskom and relevant departments. I was not a member of the Technical War Room. In response to the allegations made on this matter, it's necessary that I point out the following issues. First, my acquisition of shares in Optimum Holdings was a straightforward commercial transaction done in accordance with the regulations of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Second, as non-executive chairperson of Optimum Holdings, I was not involved in operational matters of subsidiary companies, including contractual matters between, for instance, Eskom and Optimum Mine. In Chairperson S, I acted in a number of instances in boards of various companies as chairperson. I made it a point that as non-executive chairperson on various boards I said, not to get involved in operational matters and not to get involved in contractual matters. To a point where in those roles I never knew what the procurement processes in those companies were, and I actually regarded that as a no limit, that I should never even participate in that. And I kept to that type of protocol throughout. The third one, by the time President Zuma assigned certain Eskom-related matters to me in December 2014, I had disposed of my shareholding in Optimum Holdings and had no other business interests in mining and energy. Fourth, as is evident from the documents provided to the Commission with my statement, the Eskom Technical War Room was not involved in Eskom management or operational issues. I had no interest nor any opportunity to influence Eskom's decision-making process in matters pertaining to Optima. Finally, I turn to Mr. Koko's allegation, which was also widely publicized, that I improperly interfered to procure his dismissal from Eskom in January 2018. As I detailed in my statement to the Commission, Eskom was in a severe crisis at the time. Its domestic and international lenders were threatening to call on their loans, that is, repayment, in part because of concerns about Eskom's leadership and its reaction to allegations of corruption. Eskom's predicament threatened its very existence as a going concern. It also threatened the country's sovereign rating and the country's ability to access much-needed lines of credit. An urgent meeting was held at the President's official residence on the 19th of January 2018, attended by President Zuma, Ministers Brown and Gigaba, and myself. The meeting resolved that urgent action was necessary to avert a national disaster and to restore Eskom's credibility and to instill confidence in Eskom. This would require changes to Eskom's board and its leadership. The board would further be directed to remove all Eskom executives facing allegations of corruption and other acts of impropriety, including Mr. Koko. Mr. Koko contends that his removal was an instance of unlawful interference in Eskom's affairs, executive overreach, but he also adds state capture. The suggestion that government cannot lawfully intervene in Eskom's affairs, even to avert a crisis, is completely incorrect. Government is Eskom's sole shareholder, and Eskom's Memorandum of Incorporation states that the shareholder may direct the company to take action specified by the shareholder if the company is in financial difficulty or is being mismanaged. The remedial measures thus fell substantively within the shareholder's powers as contemplated in Eskom's Memorandum of Incorporation. The mere fact that Mr. Koko was removed does not mean that his removal was intended to achieve corrupt ends or somehow to end up with the capture of Eskom. Chairperson, many people sacrificed their lives in the fight to end apartheid and to bring us to the new constitutional dispensation. When we dishonor the Constitution and we dishonor its principles and values, we dishonor those people who lost their lives as well. Since state capture is an assault on the democratic process, it is necessary that the process of extricating the state from a position of capture is inclusive, but it must also be democratic, and it must involve the broad range of interests in society. This is addressed in part by the public nature of this Commission's work. But the hard work will begin after this Commission has finalized its hearings and submitted its report. There will be, Chairperson, a need for a partnership between citizens and all branches of the state to ensure faith is restored in our institutions and in our democracy. Putting an end to state capture will enable the state to focus its efforts and resources more effectively on the provision of public services, which is critical to the transformation and development of our society. It is worth highlighting that many of our critical institutions continued to work as they needed to and as provided for in the Constitution throughout this period as well. Now, despite the damage that has been done by state capture to public institutions during this time and the resulting impact on the provision of services, the reality is that the work of government, yes, did continue, and progress has been achieved in a number of areas. This was due in part to the efforts of committed, capable, and ethical public servants and public representatives. Now, the road from the period of state capture will be long. Every measure we have instituted has taken time, and it has led to a lot of frustration as delays have led people to lose hope and faith. But it has required time and effort. And I believe, Chairperson, that we will not and we cannot relent. We've got to succeed in the task that your commission is also involved in, that we should restore the credibility of the institutions of our country and indeed repair the damage that was done to our democracy. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I had said earlier that we would take the normal tea break at 11:15. I see it's 25 past. Maybe we should take it, but I'm just concerned about the time we may be losing as well. Mr. President suggests 10 minutes. Okay, maybe we should take a break, and the President can get time for his tea as well. Okay, well, sometimes when we say 10 minutes, it ends up not being helpful because maybe it's just too little a time. Look, it's about 22 minutes past. Let's come back at 25 to. So we'll adjourn to enable to have the tea break. We adjourn. let's continue. Our 12 minutes took much longer. Has the issue of stopping time been discussed? You know, Mr. Salega?
Not yet, sir.
Okay, so maybe during the lunch it could be discussed so that when we return after lunch I can be told, because we have lost quite some time. It would be good if the President is able to go beyond 4 o'clock. But I think also the evidence leaders maybe can arrange themselves in such a way that when one finishes and another one must take over, we can do that without a break, because the breaks seem to take longer than we would like. So if maybe the evidence leaders can work on that if possible, so that as one leaves the podium, another can come in without us needing to take a break if possible. Okay, all right.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. President, Mr. Salega is going to question you on ESCOM-related matters.
Indeed, sir. Thank you. Pleased to meet you, Mr. President. Chair, just housekeeping quickly. The affidavit of Mr. President relayed, the second affidavit relating to the matters we are about to traverse, maybe should be admitted as an exhibit. That affidavit is in bundle 3, Mr. President. And I would ask you to go to page 6 of that bundle 3. And we're using the black pagination at the top left-hand corner. So on page 6 you find the first, it's a cover page with the index, and between the trend lines is written a statement by the President of the Republic of South Africa, Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa. You see that, Mr. President?
I've got the statement, yes.
It actually starts at page 8. It is just the index that comes before that.
Yes. And then it goes all the way to page 143. And on page 143, it's a signature above your name. Do you confirm that to be your signature, Mr. President?
Yes, it is.
And then the affidavit is commissioned. I see there's no handwriting of the date, but the stamped date is 24 May 2021. Confirm that to be the date when you signed your statement?
Yes.
Mr. President. And do you confirm then the contents of your affidavit as true and correct? Yes. Thank you.
And I think that was too soft.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Chairperson, may I then beg leave to have, it's actually an affidavit, I know it's titled a statement. The affidavit of Mr. President, starting from page 8 of the bundle to page 143, together with the annexures thereto, admitted as exhibit BBB 3.1.
The affidavit of President Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa that starts at page 8 of bundle 3 is admitted as an exhibit and will be marked as exhibit BBB 3.4.
Thank you.
You said 3.4, not 3.1?
3.1.
3.1.
Yes.
Correction, 3.1.
people.
You may continue.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, just by way of introduction and for the benefit of Mr. President. Mr. President, the intention was to lead your evidence in respect of 4 items in relation to ESCOM. One is the war room and the establishment of the war room, the purpose for the war room, and in relation to that is the allegations you have addressed in regard to Mr. Brian Molefe. The second issue it relates to the secondment of Mr. Molefe and Mr. Arnold Singh to ESCOM and the role that would have been played by the ANC Deployment Committee. The third issue, which you have also touched on, are the allegations of Mr. Koko. And then, lastly, also connected to Mr. Koko and Mr. Molefe, is the allegation they make about load shedding. Essentially that it was when you got appointed that load shedding came back in the country. So let's start with the war room. And I'll keep my eye on the time. Please ourselves. I know that you do deal with the war room in your affidavit, Mr. President, but maybe you could explain to the chairperson, as I have also seen that you endeavor to distinguish between the war room, the technical war room on the one hand, and the IMC on the other, and it tries to clear the confusion you say existed between the two and the role that you played in relation to the two. You could just, in summary, deal with that.
Okay. Well, then the IMC was set up, really. And IMC is an interministerial body, which I, as Deputy President, was then delegated to lead. It largely dealt with more broader strategic issues, but also had to deal with the challenges that ESCOM was going through at a very broad strategic level. The war room itself, called it the technical war room, which was largely overseen by deputy ministers and my then chief of staff, Mr. Busani Ngaweni, was the key coordinator, and it was housed at the Union Buildings. It was composed of your more technically inclined people who did the work, and it also had people from ESCOM itself. And it got involved in the more operational issues, which I, as an oversight person, did not get involved in. And all I ever really got were reports on an ongoing basis. And for the most part, they also dealt with what we had dubbed as the 5-point plan. The 5-point plan that dealt with issues of ensuring, and I would call it now in the statement, that ensured issues of how best we could increase the capacity of ESCOM and be able to get more generation that would also include the conversion of some of the power stations to gas, as we were already seeing the challenge that ESCOM was having in relation to the breakage of a number of power stations due to lack of maintenance. But it also had to deal with the maintenance program, how that maintenance program would need to be overseen. So that is the type of work that the technical war room did. So the distinction between the two was the ANC more strategic matters, of broad nature, and the technical war room of the real technical issues that needed to be dealt with. That's the extent to which those two entities were.
Yeah. I listened during your opening speech, Mr. President, that you described yourself as the chairperson of the IMC, but that you were not the chairperson of the technical war room. So, what was your role in relation, if at all, in relation to the technical war room? Now, I beg your pardon, I'm asking that question because you would have heard Mr. Koko, Mr. Molefe, have alleged that you were the chairperson of the war room. Maybe you could explain that position.
Well, I think there's a confusion, and that's why in my opening statement I sought to verify. There would be, for those who were possibly not within the bowels of government at, say, the union buildings level or cabinet level, that confusion could be there. I did play an oversight role also in the war room as I periodically received the reports, and the fact that my chief of staff at the time, Mr. Naweni, was intricately involved in the technical war room meant that from an oversight point of view, the Deputy President, yes, sought to oversee the work. But my real key role was that of chairing the IMC. That was the key role.
Yes. Well, while we are there, let me dispose of this allegation, which was that, should I assist you with the page?
No, that's fine. Yes. Yeah.
Should I assist you with the page number?
You can?
That's on page, it starts on page 57
Yes.
of the affidavit.
Indeed.
Yes.
Are you referring to page 57 of the affidavit or page 57 of the bundle?
Okay. 57 of the bundle.
Which is the black numbers from the top left.
Correct.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
Thank you. Mr. President, then I wanted to dispose of this issue while we are there, which is the allegation that when you played the role that you played in relation to the technical war room, as given your either at the time previous connection with Glencore, with OCH, that you didn't allow for a cooling off period so that there can be any potentiality of conflict on your part be dissipated. And I will do this in relation to the allegations, so I'll put them to you, and you can address them to the chairperson.
Well, Chairperson, I have heard of this cooling off period process. And it's an interesting notion. I did not appoint myself. I was appointed by the President, a President to whom I had disclosed all my sort of like business dealings of the past. A President who, on assuming office, I informed as it is expected in terms of the code of ethics, my interests, and I laid them all out, and my interests, which at the time involved my past interest in Shanduka, which through its Shanduka Resources had a shareholding in Optimum Holdings, and I had disclosed that I was disposing of all those interests, and even asked for extended time to be able to do so, which was granted. And I had also resigned from the board, as I said in my initial opening statement. So as far as I was concerned, I had distanced myself, and the President was fully aware of all these. My dealings in those two structures never revolved around issues of procurement, coal contracts, and all that. And even if by some imagination I would have recused myself immediately, because conflict of interest in my world is something that either needs to be declared or needs to be avoided. And in this regard, it had been declared, and I had completely walked away and moved away from such. So the cooling off period is an interesting notion. It's not generally, it's not been inculcated into our processes. But for me, the safeguard was having declared and having distanced myself and having been appointed by someone who knew or should have known there were enough safeguards in that regard. So I would say the allegation, in my view, falls flat because of the principles that I uphold, as well as the various actions that I had taken of resigning, of disposing, and of ensuring that I do not get involved in procurement issues.
Yes. Along with that, Mr. President, is the allegation that Glencoe / OCH, which is Optimum Coal Holdings, failed to do a due diligence at the time of acquisition of OCM. And that failure was deliberately made because Glencoe OCH knew that they could rely on your political, or on the connection they had with you as a political heavyweight, to muscle Eskom into increasing the coal price once they have acquired OCM. And I'm also going to give you a chance to respond to that allegation. It's made both by Mr. Koko and by Mr. Brian Molefe. And this, according to them, on the one hand is their reliance on your connection with them, and on the other hand, is you being placed in a position where you would be able to influence decision-making within Eskom. What do you say to that allegation?
Very interesting. When I was chair of Shanduka, we decided to set up an entity called Shanduka Resources, and through that we partnered Glencore and ourselves sought to form a consortium that would acquire some resources assets. And one of those was a coal entity, which was listed and acquired some of the shares initially through the listed counter, and thereafter felt that we should make an approach to acquire the entire shareholding. And this is acquiring shares of a holding company, which holding company would have a number of subsidiaries.
I think it's back, Mr. President.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Okay.
So when you acquire shares of a listed entity, which may have a number of subsidiaries, what you normally do is to rely on published information, which is available to everyone. And you then buy the shares, and that's precisely how it happened. There was therefore no real need to go and do a due diligence on each of the subsidiaries, because you were acquiring an entity that's listed and you're acquiring the shares. You were not necessarily buying the assets directly. And in the case of Optimum Holdings and Optimum Mine, that's the differentiation. Optimum Mine is the subsidiary, and Optimum Holdings is the listed entity. And then an offer had to be made to the board, to the shareholders, and it was for the acquisition of the shares. And whatever you acquire the holding company, you would also consequentially be acquiring the subsidiaries, which could in some cases be many, but you rely on the published information that's available to everyone. So there was therefore no need for a due diligence because you were acquiring shares. As regards thinking that, partnering with Glencore was, they were relying on my political connections. I was in business, I was not in government, and to the extent that if they ever thought so, which they didn't, as far as I'm concerned, it was just purely a business transaction, to the extent that they could have relied on me or indeed anyone else for political connections. In my case, they would have been mistaken, because much as one would have wanted to get into the coal business, it had to be a business that is run in accordance with rules and without bringing undue influence on anyone to act against the interests of, in my case, I would say a publicly owned entity, whose interests I would always want to advance. So I refute and I deny the notion that I could have been used as a politically connected person, and I reject that outrightly.
Yes. Let me also put this statement, an allegation rather made by Mr. Ramaphosa as well, to you, Mr. President, so that you could also address it in the same context. So he says, for instance, when he arrived at ESCOM, talking of the war room, he says a de facto board of the company had been established outside of the company in the form of a war room in the presidency. Management had to report to the war room. Then Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa chaired it. This effectively made him the de facto chairperson of ESCOM and put him in a powerful position to pursue Lenko's agenda at ESCOM. Were you de facto the chairperson of ESCOM?
No. I mean, even with anybody's imagination, I could never have been ESCOM's chairperson. I was deputy president, and in that role, we were dealing with the challenges that ESCOM was facing, and I could never be that blasé as to want to advance the interests of one company that everyone could have known that I was associated with in the past, much as I had already disposed of my interests. So no, I deny I was chairman of ESCOM. Even the notion of being chairman of ESCOM is quite bizarre, because how does the deputy president become the chairman of an entity like ESCOM? It would violate every corporate governance rule. At best, what the technical war room was doing was to address the challenges that ESCOM was facing at the time, and which were clearly delineated, a task which I had been asked to undertake by none other than the President of the Republic. Thank you.
Yes, I should emphasize, Mr. President, that he underscores his allegation by saying de facto and not de jure.
Yes.
So he doesn't say legally you were, but he says factually you were. So essentially you were the chairman of the board, but I think you have addressed the
I have
question.
addressed it, yes.
Now those are the conflicts alleged in regard to yourself relative to the war room. But there's an apparent conflict now in relation or contradiction in relation to the former president. And let's see how you comment on that one, because the IMC and the war room, as I read from your affidavit, with either one or two of them or both of them were established, amongst other things, to address the issue of electricity crisis in the country.
To address, sorry?
Electricity crisis
Yes.
in the country.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, Cabinet had set up the structures for that purpose. But evidence has been laid before the Commission to the effect that during March 2015, because this Cabinet establishment is December 2014, but during March 2015, the then President, Mr. Jacob Zuma, is involved in a meeting in Durban at his official residence, amongst others with Ms. Dudu Mieni, Mr. Zola Tsotsi, who was the chairperson of the ESCOM board at the time. And this is one of the meetings in which a plan is conceived or maybe hatched to establish an inquiry within ESCOM and suspend the executives. This inquiry is also, amongst others, meant to address or look into the electricity crisis in ESCOM. Were you aware of what I've said now? The meetings the former president would have had in Durban, where Ms. Dudu Mieni was present, Mr. Zola Tsotsi was present, and others, to discuss this very issue of the inquiry.
Well, maybe we should add, Mr. Selega, that in that meeting, another issue that was discussed was discussed or planned was the suspension of a number of executives at ESCOM. And you would obviously know that at some stage they were suspended and ultimately left ESCOM. So when you comment on the question, just bear in mind that this is a meeting where the president, to whom you were deputy, met with certain people in his official residence in Durban. The date was the 8th of March, 2015. And this was discussed. A number of witnesses who were present have given evidence in regard to this. Of those witnesses, only Ms. Mieni denies that the president took part in the meeting, but I think all the other witnesses say that he took part.
No, I was not aware of this meeting. Like everyone else, I got to know about the suspension of those executives, some of whom we interfaced with at the IMC, and they were suspended and they were gone. And I was not aware of the meeting and the discussions and the decision.
Would it be fair to say you would have expected to have been informed if the then president was part of discussions that would see to the suspension of executives at ESCOM in the light of your role in regard to ESCOM?
Yes, I was surprised that I was not brought into the loop, as it were, or informed. So it just happened, and yes.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Selega.
Thank you. So I understand, Mr. President, you to be saying to the chairperson, you had no prior knowledge of the suspensions.
None whatsoever.
Yeah.
After they had happened, I'm sorry, Mr. Selega, after they had happened, the suspensions, Mr. President, and maybe the removal of these executives, did the then president ever discuss with you what role, if any, he may have played and what he had known about them? Or did that never happen?
It never really was a direct type of discussion.
Okay.
So I would not be able to.
Yes. Okay, all right.
So.
Mr. Selega.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. President, I recall reading your answers to the National Assembly back in 2015, I think 18 March 2015, where your tone was rather positive about this inquiry we're talking and the suspension of the executives. You do mention it in your answer to the National Assembly. This is on the 18th of March, 7 days after the suspensions had been effected. Had you at that time decided in your mind that this was a good thing for Eskom?
The answering questions in the National Assembly, the suspensions would have happened, and that was fait accompli. It had happened, and we had to move on and move ahead. So I'm not so sure whether one expressed it in a positive light or not, because the impression one got was that they were doing their work, and they were, some of them were quite proficient in what they were doing, but one was dealing with a fait accompli, and so one, in answering questions, had to say, yes, this has happened, and we move on, and we try to address the challenges that Eskom is having. So I would not specifically be able to say, you know, am I excited? Am I happy about all this? No, it has happened, and we move on.
Well, it might be helpful, Mr. Selaga, if you have got the relevant extract at hand,
Yes, Chair.
to read that to the President so that you refresh his memory.
Yes, Chair, thank you. Mr. President, that is in bundle 5. I have given it to the President.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, I think...
Page 123. Page 123. Well, I see the page numbers are the same, whether the red or the black.
Indeed, I can see that.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a very small print.
Very small
very
print.
small. Did you say, Mr. Selaga, this was on the 18th of March 2015?
Correct, Chair.
The suspensions happened on the 11th of March.
That's right.
So this would have been 7 days later.
Correct, Chair.
Okay, all right.
This is fresh after the suspension. Paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, Mr. President, where you respond to a question, I think of Mr. Singh.
Yes.
Yes. He's specifically talking about these issues, and your response is, yes, we can say, and he's asking whether will there be light at the end of the tunnel. You say, yes, we can say there will be light at the end of the tunnel, as well as we all know. Eskom faces challenges, but these challenges are being addressed. They are being addressed notwithstanding the fact that the 4 executives have been put on leave of absence for 3 months. It is a leave of absence just for 3 months. An inquiry takes off, and as it happens, it will be done within 3 months, and thereafter, much clearer executive future will be determined. Well, it goes on. I believe that the problem at the leadership level will be addressed, and so on. Yeah.
Well, there's a prior paragraph which I thought you might have wanted to refer to, where Mr. Singh says, Mr. Chairman, that we know, Honorable Deputy President, that you've been handed the poisoned chalice. And the evidence leader is handing me another poisoned chalice. No, I mean, yes, now that you refer me to this, I recollect that they were placed on leave so that the inquiry could happen. And I want to reiterate what I said earlier, that I was not, made privy of the decision to have them either suspended or placed on leave. But it is also as I responded to it here, because I was dealing with a factual situation, fait accompli, as it were.
Yes.
Yeah.
Was Mr. President aware, were you aware that Mr. Matuna, the chief executive, had only been there for about 5 months?
Yes,
You were aware of that?
I was aware of.
May I ask you, Mr. President, in regard to the election you chose, you mentioned the options you had in your opening speech, which is also dealt with in your affidavit. And the last option, or the option you ultimately chose, was to stay.
Yes.
Stay within. And I think try to change things from within.
Yes.
And to the extent, I also get a sense that the intention was offer some resistance. Tell me if I'm correct in that assessment. Offer some resistance to some of activities that are either relating to state capture or corruption. Will that be correct?
Yes, with a view to changing things, yes.
Now, when these things were happening, I want to ask you, pursuant to that election you made, did you consider that you could do anything to find out what's happening? Why are these executives suspended? Why does ESCOM need to have an inquiry? And into what? Because the war room is here, the IMC for energy is also here. I oversee the turnaround of all these SOEs, the strategy, exactly what is going on. Did you, pursuant to that election, see it fit to approach matters in that way?
Within the context of everything else that was happening, which context would also lead me to the decision that I then took to go to President Zuma and say, I think we should close the war room, because as these suspensions happened, I suddenly realized that there were just too many initiatives that were all happening at the same time. We had the war room on one side, the IMC on one side. We had what President Zuma was doing on one side.
We had the board on
We had the board on one side and all that. To deal with the issue that you raised as a concern, for me, was to say, let's close this war room. Let's have one entry point into ESCOM. Let us even go a little further. Having closed the war room, let the board and the executive also be in charge. And I'm not so sure now of the sequencing, but one of the things I then did when I saw President Zuma was to say, let us appoint Brian Molefe as the CEO of ESCOM, close the war room, and he has proven himself to be quite an effective CEO, and let's give him the responsibility of doing so. Then there will be one entry point, and all of us would then stop what we were trying to do with regard to ESCOM, because it leads to confusion. So that was my take, and the chronology could be synchronized with what I've just said, but that's precisely the view that I took, because I was getting frustrated as well, because this action had now been taken, and there was to be an investigation and so on, and I felt we're messing things up. We're just having too many entry points. Let's have one. And that would be the CEO and the board, and they would be able to address all the challenges.
Did you have any suspicions at that stage in the light of these suspensions and an inquiry being suggested for ESCOM without you having any prior knowledge? Did you have any suspicions that there must be something untoward here? How can, being deputy president and having been given this assignment to try and oversee the turnaround strategy for ESCOM, not be consulted beforehand to say 4 executives would be suspended all at the same time?
Yeah.
There would be an inquiry into the affairs of ESCOM. I don't know anything. Did this give rise to any suspicion on your part to say maybe there's something untoward going on here, or not really?
It was more frustration, more exasperation and frustration that I had and my immediate staff also had. So that was the issue. And by suspicion, if you think that, did we think that there was something untoward that was of a dark nature? Not at the time. It was just the frustration.
Okay. Mr. Slager.
And Mr. President, in addition to that, I mean, the response to the National Assembly emphasizes that this is a leave, well, you chose the words leave of absence for 3 months. It is leave of absence just for 3 months as the inquiry takes off. And I'm sure you became aware that 3 of them never came back to ESCOM. You did become aware of that fact.
Yes, I did become aware that 3 of them never came back.
Yeah. I told you during the break that ESCOM matters are difficult. They are very complex and intriguing. So if it's difficult to answer some of the questions, it's because they're difficult.
Indeed.
It is. Because the next question is, when you became aware that they didn't come back, I go back to the chairperson's question. Did that bother you? Did that trouble you? If you're not troubled on their suspension, were you troubled or not when you learned that these 3 have been negotiated out of ESCOM?
Yes, I was troubled, and I was not even part of that process of negotiating them out. I recall just the one person who impressed me greatly was the CFO. I later heard that she had moved to another company.
That was Miss Mulefe, I think.
That's Miss Mulefe, yeah. I then had a desire to talk to her, but we never got the chance to sit and chat, and up till today. So I was never part of that whole process of getting them out of the system.
Well, you might not, Mr. President, be hearing all the evidence that comes from this commission. Obviously, nobody would hear everything except myself. Because even the evidence leaders change, so I'm the only one who doesn't change.
Of course, it's your job. I have mine.
It's my job. You might not have had this evidence that was given to this commission. One, that at the Durban meeting, that Mr. Selegari told you about, where President Zuma met with certain people, and they were Mr. Dumieni, Mr. Zola Tsotsi, Mr. Linnell, who was a consultant at SAA, a consultant for Mr. Dumieni, and I think one or two other people. The number of executives that were discussed who would be suspended were 3. And they did not include the financial director, the CFO. That was on the 8th of March. And the evidence that I had is that on the 10th of March, certain ESCOM employees, in particular Ms. Daniels and Mr. Masango, had a meeting at Melrose Arch with Mr. Koko and Mr. Salim Essa. And that at that meeting, that is now 1 day before the day when the board decided to suspend them, the executives. It was at that meeting where they discovered, or they were told, that 4 executives would be suspended. And one of them was the financial director who had been added. Prior to that, she had not featured. And the then Minister of Public Enterprises, Mr. Lynn Brown, was asked to address the board on the 11th of March. That is the morning when the decision was taken to suspend. And she was the first person who introduced into the board the 4th person, namely the financial director, as one of the people who should be suspended. Prior to that, as far as we know from what we have been told, she was not one of those to be suspended. And she was suspended. And the question has arisen, and I've put it to Ms. Lynn Brown, I've put it to other people, is where she got this name from. And the evidence I have is simply that Mr. Salim Essa and Mr. Koko had 4 names and not the 3 names that had been discussed at the Durban meeting. So I'm just mentioning that.
Yeah.
Mr. Selega.
So the capture was quite deep, Mr. President.
All that was unknown to me.
But I'm going to go into what you say was your suggestion, Mr. President, to the former president.
Yes,
for the
indeed.
appointment of Mr. Molefe.
Yes.
But as I do so, let me preface that with this question. What is your comment to the observation that the suspension and ultimate removal of the 3 executives was to pave the way or open a space for the secondment or bringing into ESCOM of people who were sympathetic to the Gupta courts?
Well, I was not alive to that, I must say. Because once they had been placed on leave, I was exasperated and felt that we needed to close all the loopholes and not have too many fingers into ESCOM and have just one entry point, and that for me would have been just the appointment of a CEO. So I must say that I was not alive and aware of the appointment or the bringing in of Gupta-linked people. I was just merely looking at it as a clear situation where you want to bring about efficiency into ESCOM. That's all I was looking at.
So you then approached the then president That is on page 66 of the bundle where you find the affidavit. You talk about you approaching the former president, Mr. Zuma, and suggested that Molefe should be appointed as CEO of Eskom. That's page 66, paragraph 131.2. In that paragraph, you talk about Mr. Matona being placed on precautionary suspension, and therefore you went and discussed this with the president, or suggested it to the president. So this would have been in 2015, after the suspensions. I want to ask you this question, Mr. President, and I don't know whether this is a coincidence or not. Again, evidence before the commission. A gentleman from a private company in 2014, Mr. Anc Disciplinary, whose company was in negotiations with Transnet for a contract. He's called to a meeting to meet with Mr. Anc Singh, because in this case, he's complaining about Transnet paying invoices late. And one of the gentlemen who wants to be a subcontractor to their company says, well, why don't you approach Mr. Anc Singh directly? That meeting is ultimately arranged, and it takes place at Melrose Arch. There he meets with Mr. Salim Essa, who seems to be coordinating the meeting. And this one meeting leads to another meeting, and I'm cutting a long story short, leads to another meeting where he's called by Mr. Salim Essa, insisting that Mr. Salim Essa's company should be subcontracted to Mr. Anc Disciplinary's company when they get the deal at Transnet. And in that conversation, Mr. Salim Essa is said to have said to him, we will show you how powerful we are. We have decided that Mr. Brian Molefe is the next boss of Eskom.
Wow.
The CEO of Eskom. This is in 2014. And he is assured, watch this space, look at the news, it will be reported soon. But then that gets to be reported in 2015. On the 17th of April 2016 by Minister Lynn Brown. So your suggestion must have been a coincidence to the then president. Or were you seeing something no one was seeing, Mr. President?
This is very complex.
It's very complex.
Yes. No, I think it was a coincidence. My approach to President Zuma was a clear proposal on how best we could take or resolve the challenges that Eskom was facing. And for me, it was a choice of Brian Molefe, whom I'd come to know over years as being a very effective, truly effective CEO, who I had also worked with in another state-owned enterprise, and we had worked extremely well together. That was Sasria. When I made the suggestion, I had no clue, no even awareness of all these issues that Mr. Seleka is talking about. It was just purely on the basis of what I knew about his capability, and also addressing another problem which I had, which was my own exasperation about not feeling that I'm making headway because of all these entry points into Eskom, and I felt we needed somebody who is an effective CEO who would be able to just virtually grab ESCOM by the scruff of its neck and take it forward in the most effective way. That's what it was all about.
Can I find out, Mr. President, whether your discussion with Mr. Zuma on that occasion, when you mentioned Mr. Brian Molefe's name, whether you came up with this name without him having said anything about Mr. Brian Molefe at all? Are you able to remember whether, from your point of view, it was just a name that you came up with? He had not mentioned anything about the name himself.
Yes, he didn't mention a name. I basically approached him that I think we should close this war room. We've got too many entry points into ESCOM. Let's have one person who will run with this process of repositioning ESCOM. And I also wanted to be disengaged from the whole process. And I then felt that Brian Molefe was the name that would be able to do the work. So he didn't come up with a name, I came up with a name and put it to him.
No, that's interesting because Ms. Lynn Brown also testified that she got the name of Brian Molefe from Mr. Zuma. Yeah. And it may well be, therefore, that Mr. Zuma mentioned that name to her because you had suggested the name to him.
It's possible.
It's possible. Of course, that question arose because part of what the commission was looking at is certain people who were appointed to certain positions. Where did this come from? You know, the idea that so and so should be in that entity and should occupy a particular position. Was it coming from people who legitimately could make those suggestions or who had the power to say, let's look at that? Now, with regard to Brian Molefe, apart from what Mr. Selega has mentioned to you, namely that in 2014 already, the evidence that the commission has had is that Mr. Salim Essa had told Mr. Hank Bester that we have already decided that Brian Molefe is going to be the next boss of ESCOM. Of course, at that time, in March 2015, Mr. Brian Molefe was the group CEO of Transnet. Yes. Now, before he got appointed to that position, which happened in 2011, in 2010, December, I think December 6 or 7 or 10, December 2010, the New Age, that newspaper that used to belong to the Guptas, had carried an article which said that, in effect, Mr. Brian Molefe was going to be the next group CEO of Transnet. This was at a time when Mr. Molefe was not even an applicant for that position. And later on, he was nominated by a board member, Mr. Sharma of Transnet. And although in terms of the points scored in the interviews, he was number 2, he was the one that was picked and became group CEO. So 2 times, sources connected with the Guptas said in advance where he was going to go. First, he was going to be the group CEO of Transnet, and he did become group CEO of Transnet. Second, they said he was going to be the next boss of ESCOM, and he did become the next boss of ESCOM. So within this context, one asked the question, where was this coming from? So Ms. Lynn Brown says she got the name from Mr. Zuma. You have said that you mentioned the name to Mr. Zuma.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. On my part, it was largely based on
His track record.
Yeah, his record, what I knew about him when he worked in Treasury. Then later I went to the PIC, and I had worked with him in Sasria when he was still in Treasury, and that was
Yeah.
yeah.
Mr. Slager.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. President, is it correct that Minister Lynn Brown, now, most probably unbeknown to her that you had recommended the name to the former president, that she would have consulted with, amongst others, yourself for the secondment of Mr. Brown Molefe to ESCO?
I would imagine it did. I don't have a direct recollection of all that. I think within the broad parameters of how we worked, I'm sure it would have happened, but right now I don't have that recollection.
Would then the consideration, suggestion, proposition or consideration for Mr. Molefe to be seconded, would it have followed the process of the ANC Deployment Committee, which is that whoever gets recommended must be a suitable candidate. He must apply and he must meet the requirements. Must be a fit. I think you used the word, it must be a fit
Yes.
for the purpose
Yes.
person.
Yeah.
Did that process get to be followed in this case?
Ordinarily, yes, it would have had to be followed, and now we don't have the minutes of the deployment committee at the time as to be able to have that type of recollection. But ordinarily, that's what would have had to happen, because this is a very big state-owned enterprise that has a huge impact on the economy of the country. So that, to answer your question, yes, that would have had to be followed.
Maybe I should ask this question, which is more general. Would it be fair, Mr. President, to work on the basis that when it came to board members and chairpersons of board members of important SOEs such as Transnet, ESCOM, DENEL, SAA, as well as the CEOs, maybe CFOs as well, I'm not sure, but certainly CEOs, would it be fair to say the question of who would fill those positions and who would be appointed would have gone through the deployment committee of the ANC?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
Some did and some did not.
Yes.
Yeah. So
But the expectation would be that it should go through them.
yeah, the expectations would be yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Let me see, so we can try to bring this to a closure, Mr. President.
Thank God.
Still a long way, Mr. President. There are still about two further evidence leaders.
I know.
Yeah. So that's the track record of Mr. Molefe. He's proposed, you say based on his track record, proposed by yourself, but he doesn't stay long at ESCOM. The announcement is made on the 17th of April 2015 by Minister Lynn Brown, and she says that she has made a decision to second him with immediate effect, which is the reason why I was asking whether did that follow the ANC deployment. She says with immediate effect. And given that this would have been consistent, his secondment would have been consistent with at least your suggestion to the then president. Were you concerned if, when in November or December 2016, you learned of his resignation from ESCOM?
Well, I think word concerned could be something that may not immediately have entered my...
Maybe what was your reaction to the news?
Well, when I heard that he had resigned, I knew that he was moving elsewhere and that we were going to have another CEO who would be appointed. So concern would not have been a word, is not the word that I would use. And I would say, yes, I noted that this had happened. Yeah.
And were you aware that that happened in the wake of the Public Protector's report
Yes.
and the allegations that had been made connecting Mr. Molefe to the Guptas in
Yes.
that report?
Indeed.
What was your view in regard to that connection? Did that surprise you? Or shall I use the word again, concern, and you can correct it?
I should say that that surprised me because I had never really connected Mr. Molefe in that way with the Gupta family. I had no inkling or knowledge or even suspicion that there was that linkage and connection. So I noted that, and of course, in the fullness of time, that became a real concern, that here was somebody that one held in high regard who was then entangled with a family that had done what it had done to capture the state, as it were. Yeah.
But there were also...
We are at 1 o'clock, Mr. Seleka.
Yes.
Okay. I will,
So I'm mentioning that because...
I will take just 2 minutes of your
yeah,
time.
okay,
Yes.
okay.
But they were also widely, at this stage, this is 2016, by this time the Guptas had landed at the Air Force, at the military Air Force, quite widespread reports about their connection to the then president. And you were aware of those reports, media reports, Mr. President?
Of course, yeah.
Let me ask you, Mr. President, did you know the Guptas?
I did deposit or depose to an affidavit
Yes.
right at the beginning when I was asked by the commission to detail, as I guess you asked other people, about their knowledge of the Guptas, their interactions with them. And in that I said, yes, I got to meet them. And I haven't read my affidavit again, but my recollection is I met them, I think for the first time. Let me just say I met them soon after we were elected, after the 53rd conference. And it was at a breakfast, and they were there. So I met them, and I did say in my affidavit that I met them again when they came to the ANC headquarters, the Tuli House, and that is when we sat down to chat. And it was at that stage when we also discussed the landing of the plane at Waterkloof Air Force Base. And when I expressed a view about the real difficulties that they had placed President Zuma in and the government by landing the plane, commercial and private plane at a military air base. So that, and I guess one more time at one of the breakfasts. And I remember one time journalists, or it was just either a member of the public who was in the breakfast. He asked me about, what do I say about the Gupta brothers being friends to President Zuma? And I said, well, they are his friends, and that's as far as I know. That's what I said. Yeah.
Chair, may I propose I stop now?
Yeah.
I'll just consider my notes. I might have 2 or so questions which I can dispose of when we come back, and I'll be brief.
Yeah, okay, no, that's all right. Let's take the lunch adjournment, and we will resume at 2. I just remind all concerned who need to have a discussion about whether we stop at 5 or 4, so to please have that discussion during the lunch break. We adjourn.
Thank you, Chair.